September 11th, 1709. A forest clearing near a small village in the Spanish Netherlands. The Duke of Marlborough stood on a low rise surveying the most formidable defensive position he had ever faced. 90,000 Frenchmen waited behind earthworks, redans, and sharpened timber barricades between two dense forests. For 2 days, Marshal Villars had turned this ground into a killing machine. Trenches, choke points, overlapping fields of artillery fire. Everything designed to do one thing: destroy the finest Allied army in Europe. Marlborough had 100,000 men. He had Eugene of Savoy at his side. He had won at Blenheim, Ramillies, and Oudenarde. He had never lost a battle. What happened in the next 8 hours would produce the bloodiest day of the entire 18th century. 20,000 Allied soldiers killed or wounded. A victory so costly that it shocked all of Europe. And a military achievement so brutal that it ultimately destroyed the career of the greatest general Britain ever produced. This is the Battle of Malplaquet, the day Marlborough won everything on the battlefield, and lost everything in London because of it. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're covering a battle that sits at the very heart of Britain's military story, a triumph of courage, discipline, and tactical genius that came at a price no one expected. Because Malplaquet wasn't just a battle, it was the moment the War of the Spanish Succession reached its terrible climax, when Britain's war effort hung on the decisions of one man, and when the question of whether victory was worth its cost was asked for the very first time in the modern era. But before we get to those forests, before we watch British infantry advance into walls of cannon fire, we need to understand why Britain was fighting in Flanders at all. Because without knowing what was at stake, the balance of power in Europe, the future of British trade, the survival of Protestant monarchies, you can't understand what drove 100,000 men to attack the most prepared defensive position in the world. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more battles lined up, each one as dramatic as Malplaquet. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 1700, when the last Habsburg king of Spain lay dying without an heir. Charles II of Spain controlled an empire stretching from Madrid to Milan, from Flanders to the Americas. Whoever inherited it would tip the balance of European power irrevocably. On his deathbed, Charles made a decision that would trigger the deadliest war Europe had seen in a generation. He left everything to Philip of Anjou, the grandson of King Louis XIV of France. Think about what that meant. The most powerful monarch in Europe, the Sun King, whose armies had already pushed French borders to the Rhine and the Alps, was now to become the grandfather of the King of Spain, a Bourbon sitting on both thrones, French merchants in the Americas, French influence in the Italian states, French armies potentially moving through the Spanish Netherlands, directly threatening Dutch trade and Britain's vital commercial routes. Europe's balance of power, carefully maintained for decades, was about to collapse entirely. Britain, the Dutch Republic, and the Austrian Habsburgs formed the Grand Alliance in 1701. Their objective was clear: prevent any single power from dominating Europe. And to lead their armies, the alliance had the perfect man. John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, was arguably the greatest general in British history. His combination of tactical brilliance and diplomatic skill was extraordinary. Keeping fractious allies united required as much genius as winning battles. Between 1704 and 1708, he delivered 4 consecutive masterpieces. At Blenheim, he shattered the myth of French invincibility and saved Vienna. At Ramillies, he rolled up an entire French army in an afternoon. At Oudenarde, he improvised a victory that should have been impossible. 3 different battlefields, 3 completely different problems, 3 overwhelming victories. No commander in Europe could match him. By 1708, France was exhausted. Louis had been fighting for 7 years. His treasury was empty, his marshals were beaten, and then came the winter of 1709, one of the worst in living memory. Here's something that changes how you understand Malplaquet entirely. By early 1709, France was broken before a single shot was fired. The winter known across Europe as the Great Freeze had descended with terrifying severity. Rivers froze solid, crops rotted, livestock died in their stalls. The harvest of 1708 had already been poor. The winter killed whatever hope remained for 1709. Famine spread across France. Bread riots erupted in Paris. Louis XIV's treasury, already stripped by years of war, had nothing left. Louis did something no French king had done in living memory. He opened direct peace negotiations with his enemies. He sent his foreign minister to The Hague with authority to accept terms that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Philip of Anjou would relinquish much of the Spanish inheritance. French border fortresses would be surrendered, nearly everything the alliance had fought for. France was prepared to concede, but the Allies overreached. Their peace terms included one final demand that pushed Louis too far. He must use French troops to remove his own grandson from the Spanish throne if Philip refused to leave. He must, in other words, make war on his own family. Louis refused. And in refusing, he did something remarkable. He appealed directly to the French people. In a public letter read from pulpits across France, he told his subjects the truth. France was in desperate straits. The Allies demanded dishonour. And if his people had to fight, he preferred fighting enemies to fighting his own grandson. It was an extraordinary moment. A sun king speaking to peasants as though they were partners. French morale, which had collapsed through defeat and famine, surged back. An army that had seemed finished found something to fight for. The man who channeled that renewed spirit was Marshal Villars. Villars was everything a French army needed in 1709. Aggressive, inspiring, personally brave to the point of recklessness, and tactically sophisticated. He understood that he could not beat Marlborough in open battle, but he could make Marlborough pay an impossible price for any advance. The 1709 campaign focused on the fortress chain protecting France's northern border. Tournai fell first, but it took 2 months of brutal siege warfare to take it, including underground tunnel fights where men hacked at each other in pitch-black passages with bayonets and shovels. Over 5,000 Allied soldiers died in the tunnels and trenches around Tournai. When it finally fell on September 3rd, Villars had gained something priceless: time. He used it to prepare a position near Malplaquet that modern military engineers would recognise as masterful. Between the forests of Sars and Taisnières lay a gap of roughly 2 kilometres. Villars blocked it with 9 earthen redans, V-shaped fortifications that channelled attackers into killing grounds where French artillery could fire from multiple angles simultaneously. The forests on either flank were filled with trenches and abattis, barricades of sharpened timber designed to shred any formation attempting to advance through the trees. 90,000 men waited behind these defences, with 80 guns positioned for maximum effect. When Marlborough arrived and surveyed the position on September 9th, his senior commanders urged caution. The defences were extraordinary. Attacking them would be expensive. Marlborough made his decision. They would attack on September 11th. His plan followed the template that had worked at Blenheim and Ramillies. Pressure both flanks simultaneously, forcing the French to strip reserves from the centre, then drive through the weakened middle with massed cavalry. It was elegant. It was logical. Against the position Villars had prepared, it would work. But the cost would be unlike anything Marlborough had faced before. At 7:30 in the morning, Allied artillery opened fire through the morning mist. 100 guns began battering the French earthworks. Then the infantry advanced. On the Allied right, Eugene of Savoy commanded roughly 30,000 German and Danish infantry. Their task was to fight into the Sars forest, push through the abattis and trenches, and turn the French left flank. What followed was one of the most savage pieces of close-quarters fighting in the entire war. Inside the forest, the disciplined, linear tactics of 18th century warfare became impossible. Men fought in small groups between the trees, using musket butts and bayonets when they couldn't reload, officers leading from the front with swords drawn. The French infantry, hungry, underpaid, fighting for the survival of their country, gave no ground without extracting maximum payment. Eugene's men took appalling casualties but kept advancing. By midday, they had fought through most of the forest, shattered in the process. Eugene himself had 2 horses shot from under him. On the Allied left, something went badly wrong. The young Prince of Orange commanded the Dutch contingent, and his orders were clear: a holding action, enough pressure to pin French forces, nothing more. Marlborough needed the left flank to demonstrate without sacrificing itself. The Prince of Orange had other ideas. Hungry for military glory, he ordered a full assault against the French right, the strongest part of the entire position. French artillery tore into the Dutch infantry as they crossed open ground. In less than 30 minutes, over 6,000 Dutch and Swiss soldiers lay dead or wounded. The elite Dutch Blue Guards were effectively annihilated. The prince had turned a diversionary attack into a catastrophe. His men had fought with extraordinary courage, reaching the French trenches. But Marshal Bouffler's reserves counterattacked and drove them back, and the French centre had not been weakened at all. It is worth pausing here. These were Britain's allies dying in extraordinary numbers because of one man's ambition, and they weren't the only ones caught in that particular tragedy. Among the Allied forces that day were men of the Royal Irish Regiment, fighting for Britain. In the French ranks was the Irish Brigade, exiled Jacobites fighting for Louis. Men from the same Irish villages, speaking the same language, killing each other in a Flemish forest for foreign kings. That is what the War of the Spanish Succession actually looked like on the ground. By early afternoon, the battle had reached its crisis. The Allied flanks had fought through the forests at enormous cost. The French centre had held. Villars, riding along his lines directing reserves with fierce energy, was the reason the French were still holding. And then at around 1 o'clock, a musket ball struck him in the knee. The wound was agonising. Villars was carried from the field unconscious. Command passed to the 67-year-old Marshal Boufflers. Boufflers was steady and experienced, but the ferocious energy that had animated the French defence had ridden away on a stretcher. Marlborough saw his moment. Lord Orkney's British infantry, 13 battalions held in reserve through the morning, now advanced against the weakened French centre. The Allied flanks, bloodied but unbroken, pressed forward simultaneously. Villars had been pulling infantry from his redans to reinforce the flanks. Those redans were now undermanned, and British soldiers were driving through the gaps. Then came the cavalry. 30,000 Allied horsemen poured through the openings in the French earthworks. Here was the decisive blow, bought at such hideous cost by the infantry on both flanks. At Ramillies, when Marlborough sent his cavalry through at the critical moment, the French had collapsed in panic. It didn't happen at Malplaquet. Boufflers took personal command of the Maison du Roi, the French royal household cavalry, the finest horsemen in France, who had guarded the Sun King's person for 50 years. He led them forward himself, at 67 years old, against wave after wave of Allied horsemen. 6 times the Allied cavalry charged, 6 times Boufflers drove them back. The ground in front of the French position became carpeted with dead horses and men. Allied officers who had fought at every one of Marlborough's previous battles said they had never seen cavalry fight like this. But while Boufflers held the cavalry, the French infantry was retreating. Slowly, in good order, maintaining their formation and cohesion, Villars' army disengaged from the earthworks and withdrew south. This was not the route of Ramillies. Malplaquet's French army left the field beaten but unbroken, fighting, not fleeing. By 3 in the afternoon, the guns fell silent. Malplaquet was over. The Allies held the battlefield. They had won. Major John Blackadder, a Scottish officer who had fought every one of Marlborough's campaigns, wrote in his diary that walking the field afterward was unlike anything he had experienced in 20 years of war. His horse could not move without stepping on bodies. Allied soldiers lay in their formations, in the lines where they had stood, in the positions from which they had fired, dead in such numbers that the field seemed to have changed colour. The Allied army had lost between 20,000 and 24,000 men killed or wounded. 1 in 5 of every soldier who had advanced that morning was dead or bleeding before nightfall. No battle of the 18th century, before or after Malplaquet, produced anything close to those figures on the winning side. Marlborough himself wrote that he had never seen so many dead on a single field in his life. The strategic result was narrow. Mons surrendered to the Allies 6 weeks later. 1 fortress captured, That was what 24,000 men had bought. There was no breakout, no march on Paris, no shattering of French resistance. The war ground on for another 4 years. And in London, the political consequences were immediate and devastating for Marlborough. Britain in 1709 was not the unified nation it had been in Blenheim's aftermath. The Tory party looked at the casualty lists from Malplaquet and saw opportunity. This was not a glorious victory. This was, they said, a slaughterhouse. The war was being prolonged not for Britain's interests, but for Marlborough's personal glory and his allies' profits. When did enough become enough? The press took up the cry. Pamphlets circulated. Parliament stirred. Queen Anne, who had cooled toward Marlborough over years of personal friction with his wife Sarah, sent no letter of congratulation after Malplaquet. No Thanksgiving service was held at St. Paul's Cathedral. The tradition after every previous Marlborough victory, the silence from the palace, said everything. Marlborough understood what was happening. He had won the most expensive battle of his career at the worst possible political moment. The victory that should have crowned his reputation had instead become the instrument of his destruction. In December 1711, he was dismissed from all his offices. Accused of corruption, stripped of his command, he went into exile on the continent. The greatest general Britain had produced would never command an army again. The war itself ended in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht. The terms were remarkable and sobering. Philip of Anjou remained King of Spain, the thing Britain had spent 12 years and rivers of blood fighting to prevent. France surrendered some territory and trading concessions, but Louis XIV's kingdom survived largely intact. In purely strategic terms, the war's results were far more modest than the cost. And yet, the Grand Alliance had prevented outright French hegemony over Europe. The Spanish Netherlands passed to Austrian control. British merchants gained trading rights in Spanish America that would prove enormously valuable across the coming century. The Royal Navy, strengthened throughout the war, now dominated the Atlantic approaches. The commercial and maritime foundations of the British century that followed were laid, in part, by the sacrifices at Malplaquet. What makes Malplaquet genuinely remarkable, what separates it from other battles, is this. It was a perfect demonstration of everything Marlborough had built. His army advanced into the most prepared defensive position in Europe and broke it. British infantry advanced into cannon fire and held their formations without flinching. Allied discipline, Allied courage, Allied professionalism. Everything Marlborough had created and nurtured over 8 campaigns was on full display that September morning. The Allied army did exactly what it was trained to do. It won. The cost was simply higher than anyone had imagined. Wellington later said that Marlborough was the greatest general Britain ever produced. He said this as a man who had defeated Napoleon himself. He knew what he was measuring. At Malplaquet, that greatness was visible in every tactical decision Marlborough made, and in every regiment that followed those decisions into the most dangerous ground in Europe. The village of Malplaquet is quiet today. French farms, flat fields, a few small monuments. Nothing in the landscape suggests what happened there on September 11th, 1709. The forests of Sars and Taisnières still stand, their trees different but their position unchanged. But the battle they witnessed shaped British military and political history in ways that echo for centuries. The question Malplaquet raised, how much blood is a victory worth? Never entirely went away. It was asked again at the Somme. It was asked at Passchendaele. Every generation that sends men to fight in foreign fields eventually confronts the same calculation that Britain faced in the autumn of 1709. John Churchill died in 1722, his reputation partially restored, but never fully recovered. He never commanded an army again. The greatest general of his age finished his career not on a battlefield, but in a drawing room, watching younger men fight smaller wars. The Sun King he had spent a decade fighting outlived him by 3 years, dying in his bed at Versailles in 1715. His kingdom intact, his grandson on the Spanish throne. Louis had lost 4 battles to Marlborough. He had survived them all. That is what makes Malplaquet matter. Not just the tactics, not just the casualty figures, but what the battle revealed about the price of military excellence. and the limits of what even the greatest soldiers can achieve when politics demands more than any army can give. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the battles that shaped Britain's destiny, the commanders who built an empire through discipline and genius, the days when everything cost more than anyone expected, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. Thank you for watching Britain's history, the stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.